I just usually start my talks with this slide, and I ask you to try to imagine life without electricity, because 1.2 billion people in the world currently don't need to imagine, because when the sun goes down, for them it's dark. And you can see that from this picture of sub-Saharan Africa taken at night from space. Now, recently I was really fortunate to be jointly leading an IAEA mission to Kenya, where there's a huge need for a massive expansion of electricity. Clean, reliable electricity. Just 30% of the population is currently connected to the grid. And this lack of electricity makes it really difficult for children to study after dark, and the streets are less safe, and reliability problems with the existing supply, together with the price volatility of imported fossil fuels, undermines efforts to create jobs and grow the economy. More than half of young people are unemployed. And trees are cut down just to put food on the table, where people still cook using wood, also causing really serious health problems from indoor air pollution. Just 1% of the population have a washing machine, creating a hugely time-consuming and laborious burden for women who do the lion's share of laundry for their families. So these are just some of the reasons why Energy for Humanity is striving to make cleaner, safer electricity generation available and affordable, especially in rapidly developing, industrializing countries. Future leaders are going to need all of the tools at their disposal to solve global challenges, including air pollution and energy security, whilst providing low-cost, clean power to billions of people and improving life chances for women and children throughout the world. So in pursuit of these goals, we strongly advocate for evidence-based, whole system and technology-inclusive solutions in pursuit of the best, by which I mean the fastest, most feasible, most cost-effective outcomes for people and nature. So this is all about being focused on the outcomes and then finding the best strategies to get us there. So happily, today, global electricity generation is rising, which is a good thing, but it makes our challenge of responding to climate change much bigger. So not only do we need to replace all of our existing fossil fuel infrastructure, but probably double or triple it to meet rising global energy demand. And that's taking into account major energy efficiency efforts as well. So where will this electricity come from to meet growing demand from rising prosperity? Well, right now, mainly from coal. Our main goal in the 21st century should be to replace coal, and yet coal remains not only the world's #1 source of electrical energy, but is also the fastest growing. So let's just consider the data for a moment. This chart shows where the world's energy comes from, comparing 1965 to 2014. Just look at the share from coal and oil. Despite the rapid rise in renewables, it's been massively overshadowed by huge increases in global energy demand in recent decades. The data shows how far zero energy has come, but how far it still has to go if we're serious about avoiding dangerous global warming. The global energy mix is still overwhelmingly around 87%, if you want to put a number on it, based on fossil fuels. Now, there have been some notable exceptions to that trend. Ontario's one. Efforts here to phase out coal have been extraordinarily successful, dramatically reducing the number of smog days and improving public health, as well as cutting carbon emissions. You can see here on the, by the way, wonderful electricitymap.org, www.electricitymap.org, that Ontario's carbon intensity, which honestly is the only metric that matters when it comes to solving climate change. Never mind renewables targets, it's about carbon intensity. Don't forget outcomes-based. Ontario's carbon intensity is well below the goal of 50 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. Likewise, even the UK has recently had a record-breaking run of 3 whole days without coal. This was big news. We still use a lot of gas, however, and so our carbon intensity is still relatively high at around 244 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour, but we're on the right track. Now, both of these places have achieved this through a combination of nuclear and renewables. And through that combination, they have beaten or in the case of the UK, are beating coal. In fact, if we look at which modern industrialized countries have successfully transitioned away from fossil fuels the fastest, they've done so with nuclear energy. In fact, we only have a handful of real-world examples of a low-carbon energy transition where a modern industrialized economy has successfully phased out coal, and those countries have achieved it through a combination of nuclear and renewables. So, by contrast, Germany, which is rejecting nuclear energy and experimenting on a massive scale by attempting to transition to a 100% renewable system, has only succeeded in further locking in dependence on coal, blowing their carbon budgets at a cost of tens of billions of euros to consumers. In fact, despite the hype around renewables targets, our analysis shows that there is no correlation between a high installed capacity of wind and solar and a low carbon intensity. Too frequently, climate solutions are framed entirely in terms of growth of renewables, which is really convenient, obviously, for manufacturers of wind and solar, but not for the public goals of decarbonisation. By setting renewables targets instead of decarbonisation targets, we are confusing the means with the end. Already, average global temperatures have risen by 1 degree since the Industrial Revolution. The speed and scale of change in the Earth's system is unprecedented. After a 2-year hiatus, carbon emissions have started rising again. So the truth is that environmentalism is in crisis. And like all crises, the first step to solving it is admitting that we have a problem. After 25 years of successfully building public and political support for action on climate change, largely through the deployment of wind and solar, coupled with energy efficiency, we have not succeeded in making a dent in the upward trajectory of emissions, not a dent. So we're being forced to admit that traditional environmentalist campaigns are not working, or at least are not working quickly enough for all the investment in cutting-edge clean technologies, popular support and political rhetoric committed to urgent action, traditional green models are not cutting through at the pace that's required. And so we have new environmentalism emerging, characterized by 2 features. Firstly, a commitment to evidence-based decision-making, and secondly, a focus on technology and innovation to help us to alleviate the environmental challenges that we face. And in practice, that means looking again at taboo technologies like nuclear energy, which, by the way, is not the same as being a techno-evangelist. I do bang on a lot about nuclear, I'll be honest. But the reason that I do that is because it's neglected and it is systematically excluded from the discourse. The reason I founded our NGO, Energy for Humanity, is because there was a need, there was a gap for environmental and humanitarian representation of this technology. So new environmentalists do not support technology for its own sake, but as a means to an end. And this is not just about renewables versus nuclear, or my pet technology is better than yours. Actually, our goal should be a technology-neutral approach focused on those larger outcomes, because if you believe that climate or air pollution or poverty or destruction of nature are the greatest risks to human health and environment and well-being, then the question we should be asking is, how do we tackle those risks in the fastest, most feasible, most cost-effective way possible? And then when we start from that point, it makes no sense to limit the tools at our disposal based on an ideological opposition to some of those tools, insisting on, as climate scientist Ken Caldeira calls it, attempting to do something already extremely difficult with one arm tied behind our backs. Now, some argue that opposition to nuclear has led to a coal-based energy policy that we have today. And the anti-nuclear movement has its roots in the peace movement, which began in opposition to nuclear weapons and radioactive fallout, and then in turn gave birth to environmentalism. And many of the same people who were against nuclear weapons then turned against nuclear reactors. And the backbone of that peace movement, that early peace movement, was a very large social category with an increasing distrust of authority: women. And most visible of all were the young. For the first time in modern history, young people made up a large part of a mass campaign. Young people began to call nuclear bombs a prime example of everything that they distrusted in society. And to this day, women and young people are considerably less supportive of nuclear power. In fact, you can see that in this chart. And these findings are replicated in surveys around the world that men are twice as likely to support nuclear as women. And that's why I started the first UK chapter of Women in Nuclear with the objectives of better representation of women in the industry, enabling more women to progress to leadership roles and to advocate. It's so important, since if we're to change public perceptions of nuclear energy, then values alignment is key. We need women speaking to women, parents to parents, and young people engaging in their own networks in order to really have this conversation. So the messenger is as important as the message, and values alignment is really key. Because research shows that your cultural identity is far more decisive in what you think about science than about how well that science is communicated or how scientifically literate you are. You're much more likely to believe science when it fits with those beliefs of your friends and neighbors. You even believe weather to be warmer or cooler, depending on your cultural worldview. So this explains why positions on climate change have become so entrenched, because it's actually not about the science. It's about our sense of identity and belonging to a tribe. And when issues become loaded with identity politics, climate change, nuclear energy, 100% renewables, gun control, our perceptions are shaped more by our cultural worldview than by the facts. And so today, increasingly environmentalists are looking again at nuclear energy, and I'm one of them. So I'm going to tell you now my story of how I overcame my fear of nuclear energy. So here I am, age 10. I was afraid of nuclear power, and I wasn't alone. As San Francisco opera director John Adams wrote, atomic bombs dominated the psychic activity of my childhood. And this resonates strongly with me, and probably many of my generation, partly because a defining moment of my childhood was reading a book called The Children of Dust, which was a powerful post-nuclear Holocaust novel by Louise Lawrence, published in 1985, when I was 10 years old. 1985 represented the height of the Cold War between the USA and the Soviet Union. The world had 65,000 nuclear warheads, 95% of them in the US and the Soviet Union, and our fragile fate rested on the very peculiar acronym MAD, Mutually Assured Destruction. The indelible image of planetary calamity had been reinforced over time in countless films and books, not least, of course, the famous China syndrome, in which greedy and dishonest nuclear plant operators threatened to cause a meltdown. That film was released just 10 days before the actual meltdown at 3 Mile Island. The author, Spencer Wirt, author of the book The Rise of Nuclear Fear, wrote, "There was no single moment when people began to feel they were living on the edge of universal death. In the imagination, nuclear war meant no future but an empty one." The clock of doom, first set by the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists at 7 minutes to midnight in 1947, was moved forward to a hair-raising 2 minutes to midnight in 1953 when the hydrogen bomb arrived. The symbolism was plain. Nuclear midnight meant the end of time. And then meanwhile, as the Cold War escalated in 1967, the US Army announced it was choosing sites for anti-ballistic missiles, rockets which could, in theory, shoot enemy nuclear missiles down. Bases near Seattle, Boston, Chicago, and 7 other major cities were chosen and suddenly singled out as a bullseye attack for a Soviet attack. By early 1969, local groups all over the country were straining to shove these fearful things away. Now, January 2018, the scientists have announced that, again, for the first time, actually, since back then, 1967, we're back at 2 minutes to midnight, due to the failure of our political leaders, of governments, to take seriously the harrowing reality of climate change. But before I go back to 2018, this is the backdrop against which here I am in my 20s, in the 1990s, after studying political science, now a full-time environmental activist, organizing events and festivals and planting forests and building eco-houses. And because I didn't fly for environmental reasons, traveling everywhere overland, including to India from Europe, to continue environmental work. And back then we campaigned against cars and deforestation and inequality and globalization. Climate change wasn't yet really a dominant concern within the movement. And back then, this is what I thought about nuclear energy. As an environmentalist, I was by default anti-nuclear. And then I got married. And by now, thankfully, the threat of nuclear war had somewhat subsided, but we'd added climate change into the mix in terms of existential threat facing the future of humanity. And as a wedding present, we were given a copy of Professor David Mckay's book, Sustainable Energy Without the Hot Air, which if you haven't read it, I really highly recommend it. It's available, free to download. And what Professor David Mckay did was he number crunched through the question of how the UK might meet its climate targets by 2050 using existing technology. And I gained two important insights from reading this book. Firstly, that we were going to make it really, really hard for ourselves to try to do that just with renewables alone, and that the land take that would be required and the resource and the cost that would be required to build out a system that was maybe 5 times the existing capacity to do it just with renewables was politically and probably publicly infeasible. And then secondly, everything that I thought I knew about nuclear was wrong. So David Mckay became the chief scientist in the government department responsible for climate change on the back of this book. And absolutely tragically, he died actually in 2016. He was a huge loss. The book made a really big impression on me. And as David showed, there's nothing better than the power of simply illustrating big data. Here's another really nice illustration of energy density by XKCD, which is a fun comic that I also recommend. And looking at energy density, which is significant for a whole bunch of reasons. Firstly, from an environmental point of view, basically you get a lot more energy from nuclear compared with anything else. A kilogram of coal will power a 60-watt light bulb for 6 days. A kilogram of uranium will power the same light bulb for around 685 years. And this means a much smaller impact across the whole life cycle, from mining to operation and waste disposal, and a smaller ecological footprint means more conservation of nature. Now, by contrast, as Professor Mckay showed, lower density sources, including large-scale renewables, are far more resource-intensive and actually can mean the industrialization of the landscape. And secondly, it's not just the output of the energy and the land take, it's also the volume of waste that's produced. For many people, it's the highly radioactive waste which causes the greatest worry. Now, I love that this small bottle represents one person's total lifetime's volume of high-level radioactive waste if they use nothing but nuclear energy for their whole life. So what about accidents? Well, not only is nuclear similar to wind in terms of carbon emissions, but also in terms of safety. And of course, it's an order of magnitude safer than fossil fuels and coal in particular. 1 day of normal operations of coal kills more people than everybody who has died as a result of any kind of nuclear accident. Now, what I've done is I've included some quotes here, but you know what? You don't have to take my word for it. What I would really encourage you to do is look for yourself at the World Health Organization and the United Nations Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation reports about Chernobyl and Fukushima, and find out for yourself what the public health impacts really have been, because a commitment to evidence-based decision-making at this time of crisis in our world is really, really important. So basically today, I'm a lot more afraid of climate change than I am of nuclear energy. And so here I am today with my daughter in the ice, which I hope isn't going to become like an exotic idea in the future. If you told me 10 years ago when my daughter was born that I'd be a nuclear advocate, I wouldn't have believed you. And it's a large part because of her that I am, and I've changed my mind. Because in 2050, we talk about 2050 as being our important milestone when we need to have achieved a lot and hit all of these, targets. It's quite an abstract idea. Well, in 2050, my daughter will be aged 42, which is the age that I am now. And so I wonder, like, how will she and how will her generation judge the efforts and errors of her parents and grandparents? So that's basically what gets me out of bed in the morning. We have a chance now really to make a difference, and I want to be able to look my daughter in the eye and tell her that there was no solution or option that I did not consider in the battle against climate change. Because people, it's bad. Already ice shelves several times the size of Manhattan Island are drifting away from the crumbling coastal shelf as the sea and the air warm. And these ice shelves are the canary in the coal mine, the experts say. Other likely changes include more frequent extreme weather events, such as heat waves, droughts, heavy rainfall with floods, ocean acidification, potentially a catastrophic mass extinction by the end of the century. Effects on humans include the threat to food security from decreasing crop yields, forced migration, the abandonment of populated areas due to sea level rise. The World Economic Forum warns that climate change and carbon pollution are strongly interconnected with many other risks, such as conflict and migration. So the scale and complexity of global warming and its causes and impacts are just so large, we don't really have the mental apparatus to respond to an abstract problem like climate change. We've created a problem that's unlike any other. It's not a threat that we're evolved to respond to, like a tiger coming into the village, or even other environmental problems that we've encountered and solved, like, say, acid rain. Climate is a cumulative problem. People think that they can wait until it's got bad and then look out the window and say, okay, it's bad now, let's solve it. But it doesn't work that way, because by then it will be too late, because the climate system has a really large inertia and greenhouse gases will remain in the atmosphere for a really long time. And many of those effects will persist not only for decades or centuries, but for tens of thousands of years to come. However, as the late great Professor Sir David Mckay said, the climate problem is mostly an energy problem. And solving climate change can essentially be boiled down to a simple two-step strategy: clean up electricity generation and then electrify everything. And where we can't electrify, okay, we need nuclear technology and other technologies to contribute towards the decarbonization of heat and the manufacture of synthetic fuels for transport. So electricity generation is a really good place to start. But electricity only accounts for about a third of our energy-related emissions. Industrial processes, heating, transport, all these things make up the rest of our energy demand. And this energy also needs to be decarbonized by mid-century. So we have this sort of scale and urgency issue, either by producing that electricity cleanly or replacing burning fuels by other means. So essentially stop burning stuff is what we need to do. The end of the age of combustion is a kind of like more highbrow thing that I like to say. So upcoming small advanced reactors, we'd like these to be included, please, in the conversation, because we think that they can help to solve these challenges, offering a really cost-effective and reliable source of low-carbon heat and electricity for various uses, citywide district heating networks, industrial processes, making hydrogen for fuel and transport. My colleagues in Helsinki in Finland have written this lovely case study, which is available on our website, energyforhumanity.org, where they've shown how using advanced nuclear reactors, small ones, to replace coal-fired CHP systems, they can achieve a relatively cost-effective deep decarbonization of district heating, electricity, and transport fuels in a city of about 1.5 million people. So during the summer, when the heat load is about 6 times less than in the winter, they can be using the surplus power to make hydrogen for the transport fleet. Amazingly, this actually got taken up by the Helsinki city governments, who are now conducting feasibility studies to look at actually doing it. How about that? And here's a beautiful visualization by my colleagues in DC at an organization called Third Way of industrial heat powered by advanced reactors. A fifth of emissions in the US stem from industrial processes. And these industries obviously provide products that are absolutely necessary for a modern economy, and they also employ about 10% of American workers. So renewables can help supply a plant with low-carbon electricity, But they're not great at producing high-temperature heat that's required by many industries. And so the high-temperature reactor in this scenario is providing both electricity and 700-degree heat, which is needed for a chemical processing facility, and it could also supply heat to other factories within a reasonable distance. These reactors can then be configured and scaled to fit a retired coal plant, making use of existing buildings, grid connections, and even the local labour force. It makes that whole conversation about ending coal much easier, much more appealing. And here's a clean transport hub. And the backbone of this clean transport hub is a small modular reactor that provides zero emissions power to charge shared autonomous vehicles waiting to pick up passengers arriving on a commuter train and a fleet of buses that's stored overnight in the depot. And during the quiet late night hours, the plant can be using its unused capacity to charge up trucks for big rigs that will have a harder time switching over to batteries when they ditch diesel. And of course, countries like France and Switzerland, which already have abundant, affordable, clean electricity from nuclear and hydro, they use that to power their entire rail line. And then finally, Arctic communities like this one are beginning to explore advanced nuclear reactors as a solution to their unique energy challenges. And some of the reactors currently in development are under 2 megawatts in size. They're tiny, small enough to fit the needs of a remote town with less than 1,000 residents. So instead of using inefficient diesel generators, these micro-reactors could be connected to a community grid and provide emissions-free power at a fraction of the cost. So many of these reactor designs, of course, they also produce heat and steam that can be used in homes and public buildings, and they could even support new industries like agriculture or food processing. And because they can operate for years without needing to be refueled, advanced reactors would allow isolated communities to be much more self-sustaining and less reliant on each shipment of fossil fuels. So, as we look to the future of energy and the environment, I wish that my daughter's world in 2050 will be cleaner and quieter and more prosperous and more connected. But whilst that progress is possible, it isn't inevitable. So we're at a watershed moment in protecting the Earth's climate, and our response will have far-reaching implications for all of our children. So we must choose our path wisely to find the fastest, most cost-effective route possible to make a rapid and meaningful transition from fossil fuels whilst ensuring human development and the protection of nature. And that's it. Thank you very much.